It was definitely a deeply masculine culture, and I think that comes from centuries or millennia of what military forces have looked like and how we've had those stereotypes about what the expectations are of someone who serves in the military. We were definitely outnumbered by men, but everything around surviving at ADFA had a real masculine sort of sense to it, and that need to fit in became sort of core to my ability to succeed there.
It was Kirstin Ferguson's first night away from home, and she was ready to call it quits. But she called her old man instead. She just waved goodbye to the family and joined the Air Force. But just an hour or so into the Australian Defence Force Academy, Kirstin was already expected to understand and embody military etiquette. And that was a shock to the system, and it brought her to tears. She cried over the phone to her dad, who'd gone through a similar military training himself, and he told her, "Don't let the bastards get you down." And she didn't. Kirstin Ferguson went on to dux her class at ADFA before completing a law degree. She also became a CEO. She serves on numerous boards and has written a book on leadership. Her determination, forged in the toughest of circumstances, would be her secret weapon as her career progressed. The stakes grew higher and the challenges became more public. You might know Kirstin Ferguson as an author, a leadership expert, or as the originator of the social media campaign Celebrating Women. But before she was any of those things, she was a cadet in the Royal Australian Air Force, and her history of career challenges began in that very first week. I'm Kellie Riordan, and this is Curveball. Welcome, Kirstin.
Thank you for having me.
Kirstin, can you take me inside your very first day as a base burials officer in the Royal Australian Air Force? What's that role entail?
Well, I should put in context, I'd been in the Air Force for 4 years before that training at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And when you graduate from there, you get posted to an Air Force base somewhere in Australia. And I happened to be posted to RAF Base Amberley, which is outside of Brisbane, which is how I've come to live in Queensland ever since. But on that very first day, I was 21 and I hadn't even been aware that there was a thing called a base burials officer, but it was a secondary duty. And so every officer was given their main role, but they also had to take on these additional tasks. And mine was the one that no one wanted. I was the classic case of the young new person turning up who was handballed this job to be base burials officer. And I hadn't ever even attended a funeral. Like, I had zero understanding of what was required. And on that very first day, I had a chaplain come and see me and say, "Jump in the car, we've got to go and see a family whose son has just died."
And so what's going through your mind that morning? I mean, you lob there, it's kind of week one. You have had this training in the military before, but as you say, never been to a funeral. Did you prep in the car?
Yes. I remember saying to the chaplain, I had no idea what to expect. I was terrified. So when you say, what was I thinking? I think I was just thinking, holy shit, what have I got myself in for? But it was a long drive, fortunately. I still remember, we drove from Amberley to the northern suburbs of Brisbane, which is a long way. And so I was asking everything I could. And then when we ended up in the living room of this grieving family, I think I probably looked like a bit of a deer in headlights and just listened and took notes about what kind of funeral they were wanting. I was listening to the chaplain as he spoke to them about their son and their loss. And it was in that moment that I really came to appreciate the important role that we actually play in supporting people who are grieving. And it was the first of about 15 funerals I ended up doing in addition to my core role in the Air Force. And I loved it. So it was a role that I held on to for as long as I could until I ended up leaving the Air Force.
And why did you sign up for the military in the first place? Like, what did 17-year-old Kirstin want to achieve by entering into the Australian Defence Force Academy straight out of high school?
I know, and I'd been at an all-girls school. I went to Skeggs Darlinghurst. I had no expectations around the fact that I was about to walk into this culture that was male-dominated, very few women at all. I was third-generation military family stock. So my grandfather had been Deputy Chief of the Australian Army. My father had gone through Duntroon and been an Army officer. So I understood broadly the real advantages that you can get from having a foundation in the military as a young officer and the leadership experiences that you get, and you get to travel and everything you see on the posters. So I was excited about that. They also paid you at that, and they still do, to go to university, and that was pretty attractive too. But it was a sliding doors moment because I'd got into UTS to study journalism, and I wonder now, if I'd gone the other way, what would have happened? And I'm finding I'm now doing a lot more writing in the media anyway. So it's funny how life comes full circle. But at that time, at 17, I jumped on a bus and found myself headed to Canberra to ADFA.
And so how many women are there at ADFA at the time?
When I was there, it was less than 10%. So I was there all through the early 1990s, which has now been the subject of much review and fairly broad condemnation for the treatment of women cadets. So there were very few of us. We were certainly outnumbered in every different aspect of academy life.
And is there something that you think is sort of inherently masculine or male about military culture? Like, is it deeper than just how many men are enlisted and there's sort of the inequality in the number of women that are there, or is it something else?
Oh, I definitely think at that time, and I can't speak for the military now because they've done an enormous amount of work to improve diversity and inclusion and equality. But at that time, it was definitely a deeply masculine culture. And I think that comes from centuries or millennia of what military forces have looked like and how we've had those stereotypes about what the expectations are of someone who serves in the military. We were definitely outnumbered by men, but everything around surviving at ADFA had a real masculine sort of sense to it, and that need to fit in became sort of core to my ability to succeed there. And I look back now with some sense of regret. I think that it took a long time in my career to embrace being who I am and being proud of the fact I was female, whereas I spent most of the time at ADFA, hoping no one noticed I was a woman at all. And then I was very successful there, and so it reinforced, well, this is how you fit in. And I've had to really unlearn that, but it was the key to surviving, that kind of environment.
You did mention there's been reviews and inquiries into the culture since you've left. A lot has changed. But there's still a journey there. There are still different things that are coming to light in the news where the military is having to think about how it, bloods up people to go into theatres of war, but at the same time creates a culture where there is some level of diversity that is welcome. What kind of, what sort of changes would you have wanted when you were there that would have made a difference to that culture?
I think one of the challenges for ADFA at that time was that silence was totally prevalent. So within the first hour of arriving, you were told you don't report anything across the road. And across the road was a euphemism to anyone who was outside of the Corps of Officer Cadets and was running the academy, so military officers. And I mean, that idea of not jacking on your mates was the term, or reporting something, was so prevalent. And I look back now and think of situations, whether they were criminal offences through to bullying, harassment, or more minor infractions, nothing ever was spoken about outside of the Corps of Officer Cadets. And I think it was an utterly misguided sense of right and wrong for cadets to think that protecting through silence was actually showing leadership, when really we should have been encouraged to speak up, as they are now, on any of those kinds of issues. And I wish that had been different at that time.
One of the other unusual things about the military, and I think it's something that you would have felt, is quite young people with not a whole lot of world experience or life experience or experience in the workplace end up in quite high positions quite quickly and have a sense of authority over others. How do you think that influences the culture?
Oh, incredibly so. So Adver at the time was very hierarchical. So it was its own little bubble or a world. And as a first year, when I first started, and every first year, you are at the mercy of the older cadets. They really can physically and mentally, at that time, pretty much do whatever they wanted to enculturate you and indoctrinate you into academy life. Now, the same thing happened when I was a third year. And so I found myself in a position of authority, very senior in as a third year, but I'm only 20 years old. I don't know anything about anything, yet you have this incredible control and power over younger cadets. And I remember at the beginning thinking, well, you yell and scream at people because that's how you get it done. And I can assure you it's exhausting for the person doing the yelling and screaming, let alone the person who's receiving it. And it's completely ineffective, and for all the reasons we know, it's very poor leadership. But that was encouraged, accepted. That was just how you did things, and you had this ridiculous level of power that wasn't warranted. And it's good to know that that has now gone. The hierarchical system that I went through doesn't exist anymore. But you're right. I think you're given power at a very young age, and that also impacts that gender inequality. You've got a lot of young men around a few young women, and things happen, and it's not okay. So it's good that that's all been reviewed and hopefully improving now.
After leaving the military, you ended up in a law firm. Now, of course, this is another very male-dominated profession, particularly at the time you were there. Lots has changed again. Did you adapt your leadership style in that environment, and what did you notice happening with other leaders around you at the time?
Well, that was a real culture shock. So I'd gone from being in the military, and I'm now doing a law degree part-time. I'm thinking I'm going to become a lawyer, and I'm about 25. So again, you look back now and you think you know lots, but obviously I didn't know much at all. But I knew I'd never wanted to spend my entire career in the military. I had loved the experience, but wanted to do more. And so found myself working in a corporate law firm. And yeah, day one, I called my boss Sir because I was used to that in the military, and he found that very amusing, and I still know him and he still gives me a hard time about that. So it took a long time to understand that, the command and control structures that exist in the military don't necessarily exist everywhere else. And a law firm's interesting because a partnership means everyone is an owner of the business, and so you have lots of distributed leaders. So yeah, I had to learn to adapt my leadership style, and I think that's been a skill that I've been able to use in so many different circumstances since then, because you do need to be able to read the room, understand how your leadership's going to be effective in that moment, and it varies in every different circumstance that you're going to find yourself in.
And I imagine there's a soft skills and hard skills difference. In the military, you could just tell someone to do something and they had to do it because that's the structure. But, in a law firm or other workplaces, you have to use your influence skills, your negotiating skills. You have to lead by example, bring people with you. It's much more of that soft skill. Is that something that you had? Did you have to grow into that, learn about that?
Well, I think you've probably tapped into one of the misnomers about military leadership. So yes, you can command someone to do something and they'll go and do it. But even at ADFA, in the very hierarchical environment, we were taught early on that unless you actually earn the respect of the people that you're leading, and these are often much older, more experienced non-commissioned officers, so corporals and sergeants and things, then, they're not going to follow you anywhere. They're certainly not going to follow you into risking their lives. And so I think I had learnt a lot in the military about the need to consult with others and to get more others' opinions on things that I had no or little understanding of. And I was able to take that into the law firms. I definitely think my soft skills were something that I developed and have a natural, I hope, sort of empathy and ability to put people at the centre of decisions. But I mean, at 25, I was nowhere near as experienced a leader as I am now. And so you make endless mistakes and hopefully learn from those. Although we've all got mistakes we continue to make all the time, we never seem to learn from. But it was a very different environment, and I learned about needing to understand who my stakeholders were, to use that term, and who, if you wanted to put through a new idea, how was that going to affect other people, and who did I need to engage in that?
You mentioned before one of your early goals was just to go about life with no one really noticing that you are, in fact, a woman. Did you let go, when did you let go of that?
Not until very recently. So even at the law firm, I mean, I don't know who I was trying to fool. I had both my children during that period. So clearly I was
you were a
revealing, woman. I was clearly. But I think I was less knowledge. Well, my eyes were not open to gender inequality at all. So at ADFA, where it blatant, overt acts of sexual harassment, discrimination, misogyny, all of that, I don't know what I was thinking other than that was just how things were. You get to, say, a law firm and it's not as overt. It's obviously much more covert, but there's decisions being made like, a woman might be on maternity leave, so she's not considered for partnership at that time. And, that's much more systemic bias, but my eyes were not open to that. I would run from women's networking events because it was so ingrained in me. I just didn't want to be seen as one of those troublemaking women who, God forbid, might ask to be paid the same as a man. So I don't think I can claim to having my eyes open at that time. And I think I was still adapting to the environment, seeing what helped people succeed and really just focusing on that. And I still hear a lot of younger women say, I don't want to be known as a female leader. I just want to be a leader. Totally understand that rationale. The challenge is, and now I realise that others see you as a female leader, and there are some challenges that come with that it's helpful for you to be aware of. But it took me a lot longer to understand that.
What do you say to your daughters now? They're at that age where they're going into the workplace, and of course the conversation around gender and equality in the workplace has shifted so dramatically. But what are the things that you're encouraging them to do or say in the workplace?
I actually don't have to encourage them to do anything. I think women, they're 22 and 20, they're far more aware of what's going on and active in standing up for their rights. So, I mean, they'll tell me things that are happening at work and how they've responded. And sometimes I can feel that old me thinking, oh my goodness, you said that and you're only this age. And I'm so proud of them. So I'm not sure that they are encountering that same inbuilt fear that I had as a young woman, that you don't speak up and that you can't sort of represent yourself as much as young women today, I think, are feeling that they can. The results aren't always positive, so I'm not saying that things are better. The outcome's not necessarily better, but that ability for them to stand up for themselves, I think, is something that I'm witnessing my daughters do incredibly well.
So you finish up at the Air Force, you have this great run in the business world, you'd gained some experiences on boards. How did you land one of the most coveted board roles in the country, which is to be part of the board of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation?
Well, coveted by many, although I equally had many people saying, are you sure? What are you getting yourself in for? I have long admired the ABC, as does most people that I know. And so the role was advertised and I applied. And, the ABC is 90 years old this year. It's an institution we've all grown up with. So the ability to sort of peek behind the scenes and actually have a role, even a small role, to play in the legacy of that organisation was something I jumped at.
Now, it's such a great role. You get to do so many things from, I can remember you being on an absolute high one year because you got to go to Triple J's big, event for the year, and it got you some cred with your kids.
I did. The one night stands, that definitely got me cred with the kids, and it was so much fun. But you do get to do some fun things, but not all the time.
No,
There's
a lot. There's a lot of hard work, and one of the sort of more famous incidents that's happened in the ABC across the last few years is that a new managing director was hired. The first female managing director of the corporation. She was also diverse. About 18 months into her tenure, the board decided to let her go, and then the chairman of the board also unexpectedly resigns during this. I'm just wondering, this thrust you into the limelight because very, very quickly you had to step up into the role of chair of the board. This is a total curveball. You did not see this coming. This happened without warning. How did you sort of steel yourself with no preparation to go into such a public role at a time when there was a lot of eyes on this situation?
Yeah, it definitely was the curveball to end all curveballs in terms of my public persona, because at that time, I hadn't been someone that had been receiving media coverage particularly at all. So it did come out of the blue. The night before it was announced I was to become acting chair, I had received a call from the then Minister from Communications asking whether I would take on the role. I didn't answer him immediately. I said I wanted a few hours to think about it because I understood the gravity of what I was saying yes to, potentially. I spoke to my husband, and I really have always had a sense of service. I think we talked about my military career. It's not often you get asked to do something like this. I knew how challenging it was going to be, and I knew that it was a really important task I was being asked to do. And I eventually said yes. And the next morning, I hadn't even had a chance to tell my children or my family or anything before I saw the Prime Minister had announced it. And so immediately my name sort of all over the ticker on the ABC News website. And off I went. But it was, an extraordinary 24 hours. And I didn't sleep much, I can assure you, between accepting and going into the office the next day.
So this is a big leadership step up for you because, as you mentioned, you'd been on multiple boards, you'd been a CEO of an organisation, a very distinguished military career. But being the public face of something and having to speak in the press is a whole different ball game, particularly when it's come out of a, somewhat controversial situation. How did you prepare for the public leadership aspect?
I didn't have time to prepare at all. I mean, it was a matter of I said yes, and here I was. And I think, I had been able to sort of ground myself as best I could in knowing what was needed at the moment, because there was obviously a lot of coverage, a lot of emotion, and a lot happening. And so I wanted to make sure I could, appear and be as calm as possible and represent the ABC as best I could. But I found myself that very first day doing a 20-minute live interview on ABC News. I'd never been on television before. So, talk about thrust straight into it, and did a number of radio interviews that day as well. And look, I'm just someone, I guess, who I try to present authentically who I am all the time, and it was really challenging, no doubt about it, but I did the best that I could. And really, I think that's all any leader can do in those situations, is not try to be anyone else and not try to gain something from it. I knew I never wanted to be the permanent chair. This was an acting chair role, and I think having that frame of mind was really important. I was there as a custodian of an incredibly privileged position for a period of time, and I had a job to do.
You did eventually hand the chair role across to Ita Buttrose, and the ABC had to appoint a new managing director. You had to see the board through that, though. Just give me a sense of what it's like to be part of a board when things are tough. And what did you learn, or what can you reflect on in your leadership style in bringing that board together to move forward?
Yeah, I think it was a really challenging time. And I've been on other boards as well, I must say, where it's really difficult. And when the stakes are high and when there's a microscope on you and when there's media coverage, it really escalates and heightens, the discussions that you're having, which is, I think, why it's important to try and remain as calm as possible and guide people through. And I also try to be as consultative as I can and understand that everyone's having, their own different experiences with what they're going through, and that everyone's voice is still important. So it was a matter of just steeling yourself to deal with the different challenges that were coming along. And there was certainly a lot. There were different Senate inquiries and different inquiries that we were having to work through, and, just taking it step by step. And, I look back now and think, it was probably the most challenging 6 months I've ever had, but I'm really pleased that I said yes, and I think I would say yes again, because again, you're being asked to do something, and those opportunities don't come along very often to hold such an important position at an important time and try and make a difference.
You mentioned there you've had some tough times in other board situations. Things get tumultuous and tricky in leadership roles and on boards. So I'm wondering how you steel yourself, or what you tell yourself when it is really dark and it's difficult and you think, I don't know if I can get through this. What's your internal dialogue?
Yeah, we're human. And so even though you might be trying to put on a calm exterior, you're privately thinking, gosh, am I, imposter syndrome is something that we all deal with. Is this something that I'm ready and able to cope with? I think having a small number of trusted advisors is really helpful, that you can be yourself with, and that you can say, look, this is how I'm feeling about this situation. What's your advice? There's definitely things that I regret, that you look back and think, oh, I wish I'd done that differently. And it's often around having courage. So having the courage to speak up about things, or you'll be getting told you can't talk about this, you can talk about that, and really your gut tells you, look, I just want to be able to be authentic and upfront and be as honest as I possibly can. So I think you do have to find a way to trust in yourself, despite you'll have endless other people giving you advice. And if you can narrow those advisors down to a key few people, I think that's definitely helpful. And I found that something that really assisted me through those different times.
This is Curveball, and I'm Kellie Riordan. Shortly, Kirstin Ferguson takes us inside a more personal moment in her leadership career. This is Curveball, and I'm Kellie Riordan. From the outside, it looked like Kirstin Ferguson was on an almost perfect winning streak. That is until she took to the stage at the 2021 UN International Women's Day lunch, and she revealed an entirely different story. Kirstin, what was the story you told on stage that day?
Well, I spoke, I think, unexpectedly about an experience of sexual harassment that I had gone through. But I think it's important to talk about the context. So that was at the time where we'd had the former Attorney General, Christian Porter, talking about what did or didn't happen in a press conference in his past. We'd had the Prime Minister talking about how the former Prime Minister, about how he'd had to speak to his wife to understand how to deal with Brittany Higgins' allegations. There was a lot going on, and I think many women were feeling angry at the time. And in the middle of all of that, I was to give the keynote address at UN International Women's Day event. And, I'd watched the bravery of so many women speaking up, and I thought, it's through their courage and the courage of other women who are supporting women who'd passed away or experienced things that it can make a difference. And so literally that morning, in front of an audience of 1,000 people, I decided to talk about a situation I had gone through. And it was empowering to do so, and I'm glad I did. And I think it was important because so many people think that issues of harassment and physical assault and those sorts of things happen to more junior women, or they happen when you're out drinking, or there's some circumstances, whereas my situation was none of those. It was, in the middle of the day wearing suits in an office building, and there was no alcohol involved at all. And I was very senior. So, I think it was an opportunity to share a story about what has happened and continues to happen for women.
Did you wish you spoke up sooner? Like, have you thought about why at the time you didn't shine a light on that? I mean, you mentioned there the context that was going on, but I'm just wondering about how you carried that for a number of years.
I think every woman I know carries stories of sexual harassment that they don't speak up about. I think it's much more common to hold it privately than it is to speak up. So, and it certainly wasn't the first time I'd been sexually harassed. And I think it just becomes one of those situations that you are fearful of the consequences and no one will believe you. And, was it as bad as I remember? Maybe I'm imagining things. Like, there's so many stories that happen in your mind. And when I spoke at UN Women, I talked about how even as the event was unfolding, I was telling myself, what will people think if someone comes in the door? They're going to think I wanted this, or, there's all of these fears that we have about talking about what happens to us as women that prevents us from speaking up. So, no, I don't think I would have done anything differently. I understand why I haven't. I still haven't named the person or what, the company or anything, because I don't want to go down that path. This is more about feeling in that context. I wanted to explain to other women that, you're not alone. One of the most moving things I did in that speech, and it's on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch it, but I asked anyone who was in the room who'd been impacted by sexual harassment or knew of, a loved one that had been, to stand. And pretty much 95% of the room stood up. And that was really emotional. And even repeating that to you now, I'm feeling emotional knowing that it happens to virtually every woman in different ways. And it's not okay.
I'm wondering what sort of response you had, not so much the public response around that very public speech, but more the little moments now where, you have a PhD in leadership, you're on the speaking circuit a lot. I imagine that there are many women who look up to you, to look at your leadership career. Has it meant that women have come forward to you to share their stories? And, has there been, I guess, is there a heaviness that you have around also having to open that box and what that means for both you and other people?
I think, and Grace Tame has talked about the heaviness she's had to carry through her disclosures. And no, I don't think it's been anything like that. I think it's more, women just know. We know what we all go through. So yes, there's lots of women who knowingly say, yep, been there and experienced that. And, that makes me angry that there's so many women who have gone through it and continue to go through it. I don't feel a heaviness because I know what was true and I know what happened to me and I know that it happens to others. I do wonder, there's a sense of, if I had spoken up about this particular person, could I have prevented anything happening to other women? I have no idea if anything has happened. That is something that probably weighs on me more heavily. But the idea that other women might come forward, I think, is fabulous, because if it helps them, I'm all for it. And that was one of the reasons why I was emboldened to speak up, was because of women like Brittany Higgins and so many others.
Just prior to that, you had run this very successful social media campaign called Celebrating Women, but it kind of came out of a quick decision you made on a beach one day. Can you tell me how this whole concept started?
Yeah, I was on summer holidays having a nice break, and the period was Donald Trump had just won. Women were taking to the streets in their pink pussy hats. There were domestic violence deaths were still continuing at an an absolutely appalling rate. And I just remember feeling really pissed off. And at the time I was on the ABC board and I liked using Twitter, but I very rarely put my head above the parapet, especially not on gender issues. And so one day on Twitter, I noticed that Patricia Karvelis, an ABC broadcaster, was receiving abuse. I can't even remember what the abuse was. It was just one of these daily events, particularly for women with a profile. And I was really pissed off. And I remember thinking, if that person said that in front of me to someone, I would do something about it. I would speak up, or I might call the police, or you would do something. Yet on social media, you feel so powerless and you're a bystander. Anyway, I took myself off for a walk along the beach, had a shandy at a local pub. And I mean, I wish now that I've told this story many times it'd been more interesting than a shandy, but that was my drink of the day. And I literally on the back of a napkin wrote out 4 questions. And I had decided I wanted to see if I could make my news feed on Twitter a little bit more positive, and rang my mum on the way home on my walk and asked her these 4 questions. She's not on social media, so she really had no idea what I was doing. And I shared her story with some photos. I didn't tell anyone she was my mum. And I noticed that people were just really interested. And she's no one special, and I say that in inverted commas. She's a retired nurse who's, done various interesting things in her life. And people wanted to hear more about these ordinary women. And so I decided then and there to commit to celebrating 2 women from all walks of life and anywhere in the world every single day of that year. And I had no idea what I was agreeing to, Kellie. Can I just tell you, had I thought this through, I'm not sure I would have known how to fit it in, or how big it would get, or that it would lead to, writing books and giving speeches about it. But it was the most rewarding year of my life. And in the end, I ended up celebrating 757 women from 37 countries around the world. And it was just extraordinary. And every woman is a role model. And I believed that at the start, and I absolutely believe that now.
You have a book coming out next year. It'll be about, sort of 2 types of leadership, the heart leadership and the head leadership. How much of each of those does a leader need? And, how is leadership changing?
Well, the book that's coming out next year is, called Head and Heart, The Art of Modern Leadership. And what I say the art of being a modern leader is knowing how much of leading with your head and your heart is needed. And I'm an adjunct professor at QUT Business School, and I've just completed the research to come up with 8 attributes, and you'll be able to measure exactly where you sit and where you can work on. And so that's all coming out very soon. But basically, any given situation, I argue, requires some elements of leading with the head and some elements of leading with the heart. And leading with your head involves things like curiosity, wisdom around, being able to make decisions without knowing all the answers or all the data, being able to read a room, having that perspective of, how are others impacted by this decision I'm making, and also having the capability and building others' capability, which is like a growth mindset. But leading with the heart, which we found through COVID, is absolutely essential, and that's leading with humility, self-awareness of the impact that we're having on ourselves and others, courage to speak up, and we've spoken a bit about that, and then really importantly, empathy. So I argue that in any context, any conversation, decision, it might be you might think it's a purely financial decision, there's going to be elements of the head and the heart that you're going to need. The art of being a modern leader is knowing how much of what is needed and when.
You do a lot of executive coaching as well. What do you think what's the biggest challenge that leaders come to you with? Is there something consistent that is tricky for leaders?
Yeah, they feel they need to have all the answers, and that, they need to, in a meeting, fill the room with their opinion or their voice or their solution. And I think working with leaders to understand that, in fact, holding on to that solution, even if you've got it and it's totally obvious because you've dealt with this 20 times before, allowing others the space to come to that themselves, or asking really good questions to help people understand how to come to that solution, that is what being a modern leader is about. Like, we no longer want these heroic leaders of the past who are all-knowing and all-seeing and all-powerful. We actually want leaders who understand that we're there to serve others and that we are there to bring out the best in others, and that we see leadership as a privilege. It's not a right. And so I think that's the essence of a modern leader. And everyone is a leader. You don't need a business card or a fancy title to be a leader, because we're all impacting others around us, whether it's, a single mum at home making decisions on how to best bring up her kids, or whether it's someone who's just a supervisor of 2 people, or maybe you're working on a checkout in a supermarket. You're still impacting the lives of those that you deal with and interact with every single day. So, it's really a book for everyone, that we're all leaders and we all have the ability to lead with our head and our heart.
And now that you've worked with so many leaders and you've been on this journey yourself around, a more empathetic, curious style of leadership, what do you reckon are some of the solutions, or what are you proactively doing to get more women into leadership roles and board positions?
I think that's just an ongoing journey that I'm always being committed to. So I have a personal rule where headhunters will often call me and ask if I know someone for a role, and I'll always give them 5 women's names. And sometimes I don't even know if those women will be entirely suited. I'll try and get it matched as best I can. But often it means it's still putting that woman's name in front of a headhunter, and they'll have a conversation, and it might not be that role that they'll be suited to, but there'll be another one. So there's lots of things you can do to amplify women. After celebrating women, the campaign, I wrote a book called Womenkind, and unlocking the power of women supporting women. And it's everything that you're asking about, how we can do small things, even on social media, where you like or congratulate a woman for achieving something in your news feed, means it gets into a broader network, and you're helping them feel that was worthwhile doing, and they'll do it again next time. And there's just so many ways you can put women forward for promotions or for speaking engagements or for different opportunities, and know that woman might say, I'm not ready or not qualified or whatever. Women say that just all the time. So I ignore that now and go, yeah, whatever. We've heard that before. Just put yourself forward and let's see what happens, because you will learn and you'll become a better leader for learning while you're in that opportunity as well.
Kirstin Ferguson, thank you so much for taking us inside your leadership career. I'm pretty glad that, when you rang your dad, he told you to keep going.
Yeah, don't let the bastards get you down. I'll never forget that. And it was the only night, that first night, only time I ever thought perhaps I've made a mistake. And I'm very glad he said that too.
Thanks for coming on to Curveball.
Thank you for having me.
That's Kirstin Ferguson. She has been in the military, she's been a lawyer, she's a leadership expert. In fact, she's written a PhD on leadership, and she has a book about leadership coming out next February 2023. If you haven't already listened to our Curveball episode with Kath Koschel, do go and download it. It's one of my favourite interviews to date. She's an amazing cricket player who ends up breaking her back and ending up in rehab, having to teach herself to walk again, not once, but twice. Her story is harrowing, it's inspiring. She ends up running this thing called the Kindness Factory and inspiring the likes of Michelle Obama and the Dalai Lama. Make sure you're following Curveball in your podcast app, because you do not want to miss Kath's incredible story. Curveball's produced by Dead Set Studios. And do me a quick favour right now, leave a review for Curveball in whichever podcast app you use. It really helps other people interested in leadership and incredible stories of inspiring people to find the show. This episode was produced by Liam Riordan. The executive producers for Curveball are Rachel Fountain and me, and you can find more at curveballshow.com.